Let's break it down straight from the hill to your hometown. No spin, no hype, just facts we find. AI's on the case, no truth left behind. Laws are written, deals are made. Who's got your back, who's throwing shade? We cut through the noise, decode the text, keeping it real. Congress in context, Congress in context, shining the light, breaking it down so you know what's right. Policies, votes, who's working for you? We bring the facts, the power is you.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place where we take your sources and, well, we try to pull out the most important insights.
That's the plan. And today, we've got something pretty hefty. The Congressional Record from May 2025.
Yeah, this is basically the official transcript, right? Everything's said and done on the House and Senate floors for that day.
Exactly. It's dense stuff. So our mission today is to kind of navigate through it for you. We want to pull out the really crucial legislative action, understand the big debates, maybe spot some trends.
Think of it as your shortcut, your context provider for what actually happened in Congress on this specific Tuesday.
We'll look at the arguments, maybe some notable speeches, the dynamics playing out, give you the context, the implications.
So, welcome to Congress in Context.
Okay, so every day in Congress, it sort of starts the same way, procedurally at least, and the record captures that.
Right. You see the House rules mentioned, how members get recognized, time limits, how they alternate between parties, the basics.
It's the framework, you know. And then you have the more formal actions log bills getting introduced, sent off to committee.
Nominations coming over from the White House to the Senate, committee meetings getting scheduled, all that necessary groundwork.
The nuts and bolts, really. But the record shows the day quickly heated up with some major policy battles.
And it looks like the absolute center of the storm on May 20th was this budget reconciliation bill. The speeches recorded here, wow, they were passionate.
Yeah, this bill really highlighted a fundamental split. On one side, you had arguments for a plan focused on, well, pretty significant tax cuts.
Aimed mostly at corporations and wealthier individuals based on the arguments presented.
That was the claim from the other side, yes.
Yeah.
And they argued that the direct result, the necessary consequence of those tax cuts was really deep cuts to social safety net programs.
And the arguments against the bill, as laid out in the record, they are stark. I mean, members citing figures like 13.7 million, even up to 14 million Americans possibly losing health care coverage.
And they didn't just use numbers. They specifically named groups they felt would be hardest hit: children with disabilities, working mothers, elderly parents in nursing homes, veterans.
People with specific conditions, too, like spina bifida, Angelman syndrome, Down syndrome, sickle cell. They were really trying to illustrate the human cost.
The potential consequences described were pretty dire. Warnings about fewer doctors, longer waits for appointments, rural hospitals potentially closing.
And even tragically, the potential for increased deaths due to lack of access to care.
Then shifting over to food assistance, the SNAP program. Arguments were made that millions of families could be affected. One member cited 1 in 7 Texans relying on it.
And the cuts were described with phrases like the biggest cut in food assistance in history. Some members even linked it back to things like tariffs making groceries more expensive already.
The language used by the bill's opponents, it was incredibly forceful. Words like shameful, cruelty, morally bankrupt, disaster.
They called it unpopular, indefensible, and a lot of anger seemed directed at the process itself, too.
Yeah, accusations that it was debated in the middle of the night, specifically 1 a.m. in the morning, the claim being to avoid public attention.
Direct accusations of lying about the impacts were made, too. And there was even mention of a proposed counter-amendment, right?
That's right, something called the Hands-Off Medicaid and SNAP Act shows the level of pushback.
And to really drive the point home, members shared these very personal stories from constituents.
Individuals like Stephanie and her son in Texas, Rachel and her son with Down syndrome, Mariah and her daughter needing therapy, Dominique with sickle cell in New Jersey.
Rhonda and her son with Angelman syndrome, a single mom in Atlanta, a veteran in rural Georgia, even a 4-year-old named Isla. It puts a face on the policy debate.
And the core argument from the opposition seemed to be that these cuts weren't really about saving money, but about funding tax breaks for the wealthy.
The language used was pointed. Billionaire donors, hedge fund managers, even name-dropping Elon Musk, mentioning wealthy heirs, corporations.
It was explicitly framed as Robin Hood in reverse.
Now, interestingly, while the record details all these arguments against the cuts, The defense presented in these sections focus more on the process complaints.
Right. They push back on the middle-of-the-night criticism, saying, look, this is pretty standard for the Rules Committee when the House schedule is packed. They even cited examples from when Democrats were in charge.
Like HRS 587, 481, and others, making the point that late nights happen.
And they also argued that Democrats fully participated in the committee markups, which naturally extends the time needed, contributing to the late floor debate.
So you really see this clash on multiple levels. Deep disagreement on policy priorities, taxes versus social spending, and also a fight over whether the legislative process itself was fair and open.
It really captures the tension. Okay, so beyond the budget, another major area of friction highlighted in the record involves the Congressional Review Act, the CRA.
Ah, yes, the CRA. That tool Congress can use to nix recent federal agency rules.
Exactly. And on this day, May 20th, there was significant debate around two specific resolutions using the CRA, SJ-Res 13 and SJ-Res 31. It's interesting how the same tool gets used for very different issues.
Let's tackle SJ-Res 31 first. That one targeted an EPA rule, right, about classifying facilities under the Clean Air Act.
Correct. It deals with how facilities are categorized major source or area source based on how much pollution they emit. The rule basically said if you emit below certain thresholds, you could be reclassified as an area source, which generally means less stringent regulations.
Okay, so what was the argument for using the CRA to overturn that EPA rule? Why did proponents want SJ-Res 31 passed?
Well, the argument presented was that it would restore a previous framework, one from the Trump administration. They claim this actually incentivizes companies to invest in pollution control because getting below those thresholds leads to lower compliance costs and fewer delays.
So the idea was lower emissions get less regulation, which encourages lowering emissions.
That was the argument made, that it allows the classification to reflect the facility's current impact, and kind of counterintuitively perhaps, they argued this ultimately leads to cleaner air.
Okay. What was the pushback? The argument against SJ-Res 31?
Opponents saw it completely differently. They argued this resolution overturns a vital public health protection against toxic air pollutants, things known to cause cancer, birth defects, neurological issues.
They claimed the rule, SJ-Res 31, aimed to restore, actually allowed thousands, maybe 4,000 major sources to increase their emissions previously.
Right. And they argued passing SJ-Res 31 would create devastating health threats and risk unprecedented contamination, even at low exposure levels. A direct clash over health versus regulatory burden.
And this whole debate got tangled up with another controversy, California's ability to set its own vehicle emission standards.
Exactly. The California waivers. Big discussion there.
Yeah.
California has this long-standing authority under the Clean Air Act going back decades. Governor Reagan, President Nixon era, to set tougher standards than the federal government.
So how did the CRA fight connect to that? What were the arguments against using the CRA to target California's authority specifically?
Critics called it totally inappropriate, an attempt to overturn decades of precedent, basically prioritizing, as they put it, big oil wealth over health.
And a way to bypass the normal legislative process for changing the Clean Air Act.
That was the accusation. Some even framed it as trying to abolish the filibuster just for the oil industry, forcing Californians to breathe dirtier air. There was also this procedural argument.
About whether it was even a rule the CRA could target.
Exactly. Claims that the Parliamentarian and the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, had already said it wasn't technically a rule under the CRA's definition. So accusations flew that proponents were trying to ignore or overrule these nonpartisan officials.
So a fight over process and substance. What was the argument for using the CRA against California's standards?
The arguments presented, though maybe less detailed in these specific source sections, focused on the idea that recent EV mandates, both federal and California's, were harmful.
Bad for the whole country, not just California.
That was the claim, that these mandates force automakers into decisions leading to production cuts, job losses, falling tax revenues nationwide. And the record does note the House had previously passed a similar CRA targeting California, and it got some Democratic support then, too.
Okay, so the CRA becomes this battleground over environment, states' rights, economic impact, and even congressional procedure itself. Wild. Now, the other CRA resolution debated, SJ-Res 13. This one was about bank mergers.
Yes, targeting a rule from the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the OCC, which oversees national banks. The rule dealt with how the OCC reviews bank merger applications.
And the case for passing SJ-Res 13 for overturning that OCC rule.
Supporters argued it got rid of a bad Biden-era rule that put up unnecessary roadblocks to what they called healthy mergers. They argued overturning it would also stop a future administration from bringing back a similar rule.
And why did they see mergers as healthy?
Their arguments included claims that mergers help smaller banks compete with the giants, achieve necessary scale and efficiency, invest more in technology, lower consumer costs, and actually have more resources for consumer protection.
They specifically argued against regulatory inaction being seen as consumer protection.
Right, and some claim the OCC rule hurt community banks by removing expedited review processes for their mergers. They pointed to the Capital One Discover merger as potentially pro-competitive and defended the OCC's past approval record as efficient, not just rubber stamping.
Okay, so the pro-merger, anti-regulation perspective. What was the counter-argument against SJ Res 13 in the record?
Well, first, some opponents called it a giant waste of time because apparently the OCC had already withdrawn the rule it targeted. But beyond that, the core concern was about unchecked big bank mergers.
Worries about negative impacts.
Yeah, arguments that these large mergers lead to layoffs, branch closures creating banking deserts, reduced service quality, and higher fees or rates for customers.
There was mention of fines, too.
Highlighting huge fines paid by banks like Citi and Wells Fargo, billions of dollars, arguing that big banks just see this as the cost of doing business, money ultimately paid by customers.
So the call was for more scrutiny.
Exactly. The need for careful vetting to ensure merging banks are committed to customers and communities. Past scandals, like at Wells Fargo, were referenced as reasons for caution and oversight. Democrats, according to the record, wanted credible mergers that follow the law and serve the community, not just the bottom line.
It's just fascinating how this one tool, the CRA, pops up in such different arenas, environment, finance, and ignites these fundamental debates about government's role, market forces, public protection. The process versus substance theme keeps coming back.
Absolutely. And while these big partisan fights took up a lot of oxygen, the record shows other things were happening too, areas with maybe more agreement or just specific focus.
Like H.R. 1969, the No Wrong Door for Veterans Act. Sounds positive. What's that about?
It aims to reauthorize and boost the Staff Sergeant Parker Gordon Fox Suicide Prevention Grant Program, the Fox Grants. The idea is to get more mental health support out to veterans through community groups, meeting them where they are, not just at VA clinics.
Makes sense. Any specific requirements mentioned?
Yes. Grantees would need to use a specific screening tool, the Columbia Protocol, the CSSRS, which is evidence-based. The record suggests this had pretty wide support.
Yeah, described as a fantastic idea that could save veterans' lives. Noted as bipartisan, even mentioning specific examples of good work being done, like by someone named Shane Sawyer.
Then there was also S97, the Securing Semiconductor Supply Chains Act.
Semiconductors. Hugely important. What does this bill do?
It directs a Commerce Department program called Select USA to work closely with state economic development groups. The goal: increase foreign direct investment FDI specifically in U.S. semiconductor manufacturing.
So basically encourage international companies to build chip factories here.
That's the idea. The thinking laid out is that chips are critical for the economy, for national security, and the global supply chain needs strengthening, needs more onshoring or reshoring. FDI is seen as a way to boost our domestic capacity.
And this one moved pretty smoothly.
Apparently so. The record notes it passed the Senate by unanimous consent, which usually signals broad agreement.
And beyond these specific bills, the record just captures snippets of all sorts of other issues being raised by members, right?
Oh, definitely. You see mentions of ongoing criticism about the California high-speed rail project, costs, delays, eminent domain issues.
Discussions about the national debt, budget math popping up, one member critiquing a focus on feelings over fiscal facts.
The debate over the SALT cap, the state and local tax deduction limit, gets mentioned, including a note about former President Trump apparently changing his stance.
The fentanyl crisis comes up with criticism of the administration's approach.
And really local stuff, too, like a member celebrating a reported pause on a work stop order for the Equinor wind project off Long Island.
Mentions of crypto scams hitting constituents. Criticism of the HHS secretary on topics from vaccines to IVF.
It just shows the sheer range. While the big solar fights grab headlines, members are constantly bringing up this huge variety of concerns.
And it's not all policy and legislation either, is it? The record also makes space for tributes and recognitions.
Yeah, that's an important part, too. Members use their time to honor people from back home, remember constituents, recognize local achievements. It connects Congress back to the districts.
We see examples like honoring someone named Mike Lightsack or historical figures like John Brown. recognizing local heroes like Victor Gomez, an Illinois Teacher of the Year.
And with Memorial Day approaching, there were tributes to service members. Specific names mentioned Michael Housey, Jason Barfield, Thomas Forrest Riddle, saluting units serving abroad, like the 1st Armored Brigade Combat Team.
It really adds a human dimension, highlighting local businesses too, like Elwell's Country Meats or the Quilted Forest.
Celebrating student speech winners. Sports teams like the Push Ridge tennis team winning a state title. Military academy appointments like Lindsay Hatcher going to West Point.
It shows that Congress is also a place where local stories and community pride get put into the official federal record, a bridge between Washington and home.
And looking back at the whole day's record, kind of reinforces how the process works, doesn't it? You see the Rules Committee acting as that gatekeeper for floor debate.
You see unanimous consent being used or blocked to speed things up or slow them down.
And those CRA debates, especially the California one, really highlighted the fights over procedure itself, who interprets the rules, the role of the parliamentarian, the GAO. It gets messy.
Even small things, like members putting in explanations for missed votes, show how detailed the record-keeping is.
So when you pull back and look at everything covered just on May 20th, these intense budget clashes, the regulatory fights using the CRA, the progress on veterans care or semiconductors, all those local tributes, what does it all mean for you, the listener?
Well, it shows just how broad the scope of Congress is on any given day, and how these debates, even the procedural ones, connect directly to things like your health care, food security, air quality, financial services, support for veterans. It's not abstract stuff.
And it underscores that the congressional record, while maybe a bit intimidating, is really a key public resource. It's where you can find the different arguments, the actual legislative text, the votes, the stories being told on the floor.
We've taken this deep dive into just one day, May 20th, 2025. It reveals these intense policy battles, but also the quieter work of representation.
And considering the passionate, often completely contradictory arguments we saw presented in the record, especially on big issues like the budget or regulation, it maybe leaves you with a thought to ponder. How do you personally sift through it all? How do you evaluate complex policies and try to get past the political spin to understand the real substance and potential impact?
Something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the congressional record. We hope you'll keep exploring the sources that shape our world.